Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rochelle Hadlin with Goodman Schwartz Public Affairs, and presenting with me today is Brandy Patron, also from Goodman Schwartz Public Affairs. First, we're going to go through a couple housekeeping items, allow some more folks to hop on and get rid of any technical glitches that we might be having. So first, when you join the webinar, you're going to see a static screen. You do have to click on that link on the screen to join the actual webinar, to see the PowerPoint, and to see what we're seeing. Keep your webinar link handy. It's located in the confirmation email we sent you. You're going to see the PowerPoint presentation slide right now and not an actual person. So if you see that, you're in the right place, and we'll start in a couple minutes. We are recording, so you won't be able to speak during the webinar, but you will be able to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions during the presentation. Make sure you mark that chat as a question. Give me a second, and then we'll respond as quickly as possible throughout the presentation to your questions. There are some best practices for viewing this webinar. An Ethernet connection is best, so if you have that, please try and use an Ethernet connection. It's just going to give you a better video quality. A dependable high-speed Wi-Fi connection also works as well. So if you are on a Wi-Fi connection, please do be sure to shut down programs that also use the internet to reduce the risk of them interfering with the webinar. You might experience some buffering right away on Wi-Fi. That is totally normal, but if it goes on for more than a few minutes, please refresh your page or rejoin the webinar, especially if you can't see or hear us after we get going here. If you do get bounced from the webinar for any reason, you'll just want to refresh your screen by clicking the blue refresh button in the dark bar at the bottom of the screen. And if that doesn't work, close out completely, go to that confirmation email and rejoin the webinar that way. If for some reason you can't get the webinar to work today, the recording of it will be available immediately after it wraps up on our APAD Arizona YouTube page, and we'll also send an email to all of our attendees with that link so that you can rewatch it whenever you would like. So to kick things off today, today's webinar is a closer look at the Arizona state budget and budget process. We do anticipate that we will use the full-time advertised today. So if you do need to drop off for any reason, please be sure to come back and watch what you missed on the recording on our YouTube page. While we cover the basics of the Arizona State Legislature and how a bill becomes a law during our last webinar, there wasn't exactly time to talk in detail about our state budget, which, as you all probably know, is a huge part of our APAD meeting discussions. We wanted to help you get a better idea of that process so that you have some context as to where we are in the process during the 2017 session and why our advocacy calls to action regarding the budget are so important. So with that, if anybody is having technical difficulties, please use that chat feature and I will do my best to get you up and running. And I will turn things over to Brandy Patron, who will be doing the presentation on the state budget and budget process for you today.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brandy Patron. Again, thank you so much, Rochelle. We are going to get started today on the budget. Give me here just a second here to get things rolling. So what we wanted to, again, as Rochelle talked about, is to provide an overview of the Arizona state budget and how the process works. What I think is important to note is for this entire presentation, we're going to be talking in generalities about the state budget process. We'll give you some specifics about where the budget's looking like for the state today and some details about what the agencies are proposing at the moment. But overall, it's a general process. As we talked about in the last webinar, there are changes happening next legislative session in January because of the elections. And so because of that, we will have a new Speaker of the House, we will have a new President of the Senate, and new members of the legislature on the whole. And so with that potentially comes changes in the budget process. There might be differences compared to the last legislative session or not. And so we're going to talk in general about the budget And then as we get through the next legislative session, as you all work with us, then we'll learn what those changes might be come January. So first wanted to start about what the Constitution says about the state budget. And the Constitution does not contain a specific requirement that the legislature adopt a balanced budget, but it basically makes it very difficult or almost impossible for the legislature, the state, to finance a long-term deficit. So the Constitution requires that the legislature submit a budget that is sufficient to meet the state's necessary expenses. And if they unintentionally spend more than generated in revenue, the state is allowed to carry over that deficit. But then the Constitution requires that any deficit must be paid in the following fiscal year. The Constitution also does permit the legislature to issue no more than $350,000 in general obligation bonds to finance a deficit, which limits the state's capacity to run any long-term budget deficits. So putting all of these provisions in place in the Constitution, there really are constraints on what type of budget and whether or not there can be any long-term deficit for the state. State statute also has a lot to do with the constraints that are put on the legislature and the governor. So the governor is required to submit to the legislature a budget that talks about the revenues that are sufficient to meet the proposed expenditures in the governor's plan. So therefore, the governor has to submit a budget to the legislature that is balanced. The governor is required to submit a budget to the legislature no later than 5 days after the regular session of the legislature convenes. So between both the statutes and the Constitution, the legislature and the executive do have to put out and pass a budget that is balanced with really very little to none long-term debt in order for them to pass that budget. So for Arizona, we budget on the fiscal year like most other states do. Our fiscal year is the 12-month period beginning on July 1st and it ends on June 30th. So for example, fiscal year 2017 would be written, you'll see there in the middle, fiscal year 2016 to 2017. This year begins on July 1st, 2016 and ends on June 30th, 2017. So we always call it by the last year, the year that that fiscal year ends. So in January, when the legislature and the executive come to work on the state budget, we will be working on state fiscal year 2018 this coming session. So in statute, the Arizona state budget actually has a bifurcated budget cycle. There are 17 large state agencies that are known as annual budget units. And then the legislature is supposed to adopt a one-year budget for each of those state agencies. Then the rest of the state agencies are on biennial budgets, where the legislature adopts two-year budgets with each year separately delineated. Those 17 large agencies are the big ones that you would normally think of: Department of Economic Security, Department of Health, Department of Administration, Department of Environmental Quality. And those smaller agencies are like licensure boards, those that license medical doctors or physical therapists, for example. However, this cycle has been suspended in recent years, so all agencies have actually received separate annual budgets starting in fiscal year 2010. And if you think about when we were going through the bad budget times for the state, that hit in about fiscal year 09 for the state. And so at that time, it became more difficult to try and anticipate what was happening on a regular basis with the economy as it was going down. And so trying to forecast out 2 years became problematic. And so they did suspend that requirement in state statute to allow them to only have to put together 1 year of a budget. Although later on, a few years later after we had the downturn in the economy, there was a state statute that was passed that does require the legislature and the executive to look at the at 3 fiscal years at a time. So when we go into this next legislative session, again, we'll be talking about fiscal year 2018. However, you will see estimates and information also about fiscal years 19 and 20. And that's because we will pass fiscal year 18's budget, but based on what we pass for the fiscal year 18 budget, the legislature and the executive have to look at what's happening in 19 and 20. So although we have suspended this requirement that we do some state agencies on a biannual basis, we are looking now at 3 fiscal years of an impact for what the revenues and expenditures might be. But again, only adopting 1 budget year at a time. So again, we're going to talk about the general state budget process, and these are the steps that take place, and we'll talk specifically more about each of these. But in short, the agencies submit information to the executive. That information is reviewed by the governor's office. They release a budget. The legislature's budget office produces a baseline budget, which we'll talk about. There are budget hearings. There are also private negotiations. And then when agreement is reached, the budget bills are drafted. We go through the regular budget process that we talked about in our last webinar for committee hearings, Cal, and third read. And then there's action by the governor on the budget. So let's talk about state agency submittals. So each state agency is required to prepare their budget requests within the guidelines that are set forth by the governor. And each governor can set their requirements and guidelines for their state agencies as they would like. Some governors have limited the amount or the asks that the agencies can make. Some governors have not, but those state agencies have to meet those guidelines and requirements that their governor has set for them. They're required to submit these budget requests to the Office of Strategic and Planning and Budgeting, also known as OSPB, which you'll hear me say a lot. And that's the governor's budget office. And they're required to submit those requests by September 1 for the following fiscal year. So for example, for fiscal year 2018, the state agencies were required to submit their budget requests to OSPB by September 1st of this year. And so those are all available to us. Now we'll talk a little bit about what are in some of those requests. I think what's important to note, though, is that this is the consideration and the needs that the agencies have put forth. It is not a requirement that the executive will take those suggestions. It is simply information about the needs that that state agency has, but it is not a requirement that the governor or the executive move forward with those changes. So the Department of Economic Security did put forth their requirements on their request, on September 1st, and wanted to talk briefly about what was requested for the Division of Developmental Disabilities, which for APAD providers is where the majority of the funding goes for the services that are provided. So the first request that they are making to the governor's office is a 1% increase for reimbursement rates for home and community-based services. So this is a 1% across the board increase up to 100%. So no service would go over 100% of benchmark. This is the same increase that we APAD were able to get into the budget last legislative session, a 1% increase. This would be the same thing. This equates to about $3 million in state general funds. That is, as you all know, matched by the federal government. It's about a 3-to-1 match, or 2-to-1 match, so we bring down $6 million in federal funds for a total of $9 million. So while the general fund request is almost $3 million, the total fund request, should it be approved, would be a $9 million increase to the Division of Developmental Disabilities in order to provide for this 1% increase across the board. The other request that DDD has made is $16.4 million for long-term care caseload growth and cost increases. This $16.4 million allows the division to maintain their current services. It does not expand their program or their services. And it also doesn't necessarily equate to an increase in reimbursement rates. This is solely for the program itself. And so I want to talk a little bit more in detail about this. So these two requests are both increases for DDD, but have very different functions. And the 1% increase, should it be funded, again, goes to reimbursement rates. The $16.4 million is really just for that caseload growth and cost increases, and it's known as capitation. So I think it's important for all of us to understand what the difference is between capitation and the rate increases. A lot of times legislators will say to APAD, well, it's in the budget and they're asking for $16.4 million for you. Isn't that going to help you? And while that money, should it be funded, does help the system as a whole and could turn out in some cases to be additional money for reimbursement rates, it isn't always the case. Can you share your screen? Give me one moment, folks. I'm going to reshare my screen here. We're having some issues. Okay, let's hopefully that's works. Sorry about that, guys. See if we've got that back up. So again, we hear from legislators about the fact that, well, there's $16.4 million being asked for, doesn't that help? So I wanted to talk about the difference between capitation and rate increases so that we all understand. So Access is the state Medicaid agency, and they draw down the federal match. So the state spends state general fund dollars on the Medicaid services, and the federal government matches those dollars spent 2 or 3 to 1. When you put together those general fund dollars and the federal dollars we receive, that together is called capitation. And Access uses that capitation, those capitation funds, to pay for the Medicaid program, and then they adjust those capitation payments as necessary. This includes the capitation payments made to DES-DDD. So what happens is that through the state budget, DDD, because it's a state agency, is appropriated the state general fund portion of the state match. And there's an interagency agreement between DES and Access, which allows Access to draw down that federal match that was appropriated to DES through the state general fund budget. So when the budget is passed, there's 2 sets of pots of money passed in the state for the state general fund through DES and through Access. All of that money essentially funnels through Access to the federal government for the match, draws down the federal dollars, and all comes back to the state as capitation. So DES, DDD, when the division spends money, it is also spending capitation. And so when the division gets an increase in capitation, they are getting an increase to fund the growth of the program or the growth and utilization of the program. This could be people or services. And so there have been cases in the past where a capitation increase has meant an increase in reimbursement rates to providers. So for example, in fiscal year 16, Access saw a need to try and increase the reimbursement rates. And so there was a 1.5% capitation increase to the Division of Developmental Disabilities. And that capitation increase was required to go to reimbursement rates. So while we didn't get anything in the budget that year, in October for fiscal year 16, there was an increase in the reimbursement rates because of that capitation increase. However, for fiscal year 17, there was an increase in capitation to the Division of Developmental Disabilities that was for growth. There was growth in the program, and also that money went towards some increases in staff and support coordinator salaries in order to reduce the turnover that the agency is having. So while there was an increase in capitation, that money in this case didn't go to reimbursement rates. So again, if you all get questions about the difference between capitation or a rate increase, or get the question about, well, we're funding in this case, 16.4 million is the request for capitation. I think it's really important for us to be able to explain to legislators and others that that doesn't always equate to an increase in reimbursement rates, and is different than what the request is, for example, for the 1% that goes directly to reimbursement rate increases. So I hope that makes sense. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but I thought it was an important distinction for us to make as we're moving through the budget process. We do get that question a lot from legislators. So some issues with our sound. All right, hopefully we've gotten our sound quality a little bit better. Sorry about that, we're working on it. So again, the executive budget. So at this point in time, the state agencies have provided their requests to the governor's office, and the Office of Strategic and Planning and Budgeting, OSPB, is going to consider all of those state budget requests. They're also going to consider the executive priorities for the year, and they're going to put that together into a budget. And what you hear a lot from the governor's office are they talk about their budget priorities. And you'll hear in the State of the State address that the governor gives at the beginning of the year, which is the opening day of the legislative session, some clues about those budget priorities. So for example, last year, Governor Ducey talked about wanting to strengthen border security in his State of the State address. So what you saw then in the budget priorities that were passed or that were proposed on that Friday was a Department of Public Safety border strike force that was in the budget for about $30 million. So their priorities that they have from a subject area perspective for the state turn into some of the budget requests that you'll see. So that entire package is what's submitted to the legislature for consideration. And again, remember, the governor's office is required to propose a balanced budget. So at the same time, at the beginning of session, the legislature's budget office, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, or JLBC, is also producing a budget document, and this is known as a baseline budget. Here, the word budget is a misnomer in that it's not something that the legislature is proposing for the state budget. What it does reflect is the economic forecasting that the office has done, along with spending estimates that are based on the funding formula requirements and other obligations that are in statute. So unlike the governor's budget, the baseline document that is put out by JLBC does not include discretionary spending, and it does not include revenue changes that are a decision made by the governor's office. It's not a budget proposal. So, for example, there are requirements in state statute that talk about education, and there's a funding formula that, and I'm going to simplify this, but basically says for every student in school, the legislature of the state shall pay, let's say, $1,000, and that's very low. But that funding formula, unless changed, produces an amount that the legislature is required to spend. So what JLBC is doing in this baseline document is taking all of those funding formulas, like that education funding formula in statute, taking the necessary forecasting that has to happen, forecasting our spending estimates, and putting that together. So if we did nothing else and did no other changes in state statute, how much would the state of Arizona have to spend for what's currently in the books, currently in statute? So the baseline, again, is guidance on our projected spending, our projected balance, but it does not include the discretionary spending or discretionary changes like the governor's budget does. So baseline, it's a good place for us to start in looking at what the state statutes put together and require the state to produce and to fund. So real quickly, just wanted to give you a snapshot of where the spending, where the money goes. And if you look in the pie chart here, 26% of the state's total $37 billion budget is general fund dollars. So between that 26% general fund and then the 11% other appropriated funds, so those are monies that come from other sources but are appropriated by the state legislature and the governor, that's really the amount of money that the legislature and the executive have to work with. That's the amount of money that they have to make decisions on. For the majority of the federal funds and for the majority of the non-appropriated funds, there are strings attached, and I use that term loosely. There are requirements attached by federal law or state statute on how those funds have to be spent. And so unless they're, for the state ones, there are state changes made either through an election or potentially just through a vote at the legislature, or there's changes made at the federal level, those funds really can't be touched or changed. So when you take a look at the entire pie for the state of Arizona, there is a relatively small amount of dollars that are discretionary, so to speak, in the way that the legislature and the executive can make changes to. So talked a little bit about the revenue estimates that JLBC puts together. And I think it's important to understand how they put those forecasts together. JLBC and OSPB have separate independent revenue estimates, but the governor and the legislature are not bound by these revenue forecasts. If the legislature and the governor decided that they wanted to change the forecast numbers that their budget office gave them, they could. They can lower them or increase them. And so these are really recommendations to the legislature and to the executive. For JLBC, it's a very public process. They have a finance advisory committee, which meets 3 times yearly. They just met this last October, or this month, excuse me, at the beginning of this month. I'm already into November. And they take the revenue estimates from the full committee, the Finance Advisory Committee, an average of what the committee has put together. They put together as a staff, the JLBC staff put together a revenue estimate. And then there's 2 models that are used that are done by the University of Arizona. And those 4 different estimates produce what they call a 4-sector consensus revenue estimate. So if you take a look at this, this was the latest one earlier here in the month in October that was put together. So what you'll see at the bottom are the 4 different revenue estimates that came out. You have the U of A 2 models, you have the Finance Advisory Committee model, and then you have the JLBC staff. And so for fiscal year 17 on the left-hand side, if you average those together, it's and I believe they do weight some of them. It's 3.8% is what they're estimating for revenue growth for the state in fiscal year 17. And then for fiscal year 18, using that model, they're looking at a 4% growth. What I think is important to also understand with these is these are estimates, right? These are best guesses, just like any economic model, whether it's state or national. And a 1% difference in these estimates equates to $600 million impact over the next 3 fiscal years. So for example, if they're off by 1% for fiscal year 18, that impacts fiscal year 18, 19, and 20 by about $600 million. So a 1% difference really makes a huge difference in the amount of money available that the legislature and executive believe or don't believe that we have to work with as far as spending goes. So estimates are hard. They do the best that they can. but it is hard to forecast, and especially to forecast further out. The further out you go, the harder it gets. So after the budget, executive budget is released and the baseline is released, what happens is that both the Senate and the House appropriations committees put together a process to have some budget hearings. Generally, the two appropriations committees will set a schedule to hear some of the larger agencies and any major issues. And they actually hear them on the same week so that they're moving through the process at the same time. And they do this for about the first 2 months of the legislative session, so January and February. Each appropriations committee in the House and the Senate has the ability to hear other issues as well on the budget, but generally speaking, they stick to this schedule. In this hearing that we're going to look at today, we're going to hear about a total of 10 minutes for the committee, but I am going to break it up and skip some sections here. At this hearing, the Senate Appropriations Committee was listening to corrections in the Department of Economic Security. We're not going to listen to anything on the corrections piece, wanted to hear what they had to say about the Department of Economic Security. When I do start the video, what has already happened is that the committee has heard from the Joint Legislative Budget Committee staff, and staff has given an overview of the executive recommendations that were in the budget and has given an overview about any of the JLBC baseline information that is necessary for the committee to understand the potential differences between the two. So for example, the JLBC baseline had a slightly different estimate for growth when it came to DDD than the governor had in his executive budget recommendations, but I think they were only off by about 1%. But so that conversation has already happened when we get into this committee hearing. You're also going to hear a lot of support from the committee members for DDD and for an increase in DDD funding. And I want to point out that this doesn't happen on its own. This has a lot to do with the work that APAD members did prior to this committee hearing and talking to legislators on this committee and other committees about the impact and the need for additional funding. So by educating legislators ahead of time, APAD was able to make sure that by the time they got to committee, they could ask some great questions and have a really great conversation about the need for DDD funding. And this is what is necessary for the budget process throughout the entire session. We really have to continue to talk and educate all session long about these, because as we'll understand through the process, the budget process does take some time and also happens in a lot of small group meetings that we're not a part of. So meeting with legislators on a regular basis is really, really important. We're also going to see a couple of speakers talk. We worked with our APAD members to have a few folks speak at the hearing and to make sure that we got the right messages out. Goodman Schwartz does do this for APAD as well, but it is great when we can have real people testify in committees, and so we work hard to do that. So again, we're going to listen to about 10 minutes, but I'm going to skip through a few things. This was a 2-hour budget hearing, so we're definitely not going to have time to hear it all, but just wanted to give you all a flavor of this committee hearing. So again, this is Senate Appropriations Committee.
Speaking of page 8 and the DD appropriations, is it true that the reimbursement rates for DD is at still around 71, 72%? Do you know that offhand? And I know we cut them back several years ago, and I'm wondering what you might know about that. Are you referring to Mr. Chairman? Are you referring to the state-owned long-term care services line? No, I'm talking, Mr. Chairman, just about the overall reimbursement rates for DD population. I'm sorry, I can't speak to that. I would have to. No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Staff. Okay, any other questions for JLBC staff? Hearing none, thank you very much for that presentation. Director Jeffries, wherever you are, there you are. Listen, here's how I'd like to do it if you're in agreement. That's kind of give us a good overview. What I'd like to do is have you stand for questions for members, if that be all right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, honorable senators. I'm pleased to answer any and all questions that you have.
Senator Smith, would you like to ask that question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Jeffries, do you know about the reimbursement rate for the DD population? As memory serves, I think it was around 78 to 80% in the 09 era. It was cut back about 15%. They've been given back about 8%. And I think that places them somewhere around the 71, 72%. Do you know the exact federal match to that? Are you requesting anywhere in your office to be restored the rest of that reimbursement rate that was cut?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith, the reimbursement rate is in the range that you articulated as it pertains to engaging our federal partners. We try to bring home every dollar we can that we have to send over the Mississippi River. But as you know, whether it's DD or any number of other social services we have, typically it takes state general fund to acquire the funds across the Mississippi.
And Mr. Chairman, I guess, Mr. Jeffries, are you requesting, or is your department requesting the restoration of those reimbursements anywhere? I think there's still about 7 points on that. Is that an immediate need that you're requesting?
Well, we've made a myriad of general fund requests as it pertains to requesting additional funds from the federal government. We would rely on our federal delegation to assist us with that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Senator Smith.
You would be requesting the state dollars first to get the federal match. So my question is, are you requesting anywhere those state dollars to receive the federal match to be, quote, made whole from the initial reimbursement cost
In
from
the governor's office, budget. To the best of my knowledge, there's not that request, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, excuse me for 1 second. Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith, Director for the Patients.
Sure.
It is not, those funds are not in the governor's executive recommendation.
Yes, well, let me jump in here for just a second. There have been a number of folks that are involved in the DD community that have come by and seen members today, and will probably continue to do that. I would just say that two of the fellows who came to me today on the floor and said they would like to include that in budget negotiations, one to the left of me and one to the right of me. And so your efforts have had and one to the front of me. And one to the far left. And one to the far left, yeah. So you're, it could be. So I wanted to tell everyone here that your efforts are having some results, and would encourage you to keep up with that. And I know Director Jeffries and I have talked about it, and he's part of a team, so sometimes he has to be a team player. So anyway, any other questions for Director Jeffries? Shocking. Senator Farley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Jeffries.
Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead just here a little bit. If you might need to turn your microphones up on your computers just a little bit. When the legislators don't speak into their microphones, sometimes it's hard to hear them, so apologize for that if you're having a little difficulty hearing them. We're going to skip now, after the questions that the legislators had, to some testimony again that we had coordinated with our APAD members, and we'll just listen in for a few minutes here.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Director.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Wishing to speak neutral on the bill, Monica Attridge, Hani Foundation.
Okay. I have, why don't you do this, Mr. Vice Chair, if you would, just name the folks in kind of the order, and then I'm going to call some folks up.
Monica Attridge, Hazani Foundation, Randall Gray, Self, Erin Rodden, Arizona Child Care Association, and Wendell Clark, Pima Council on the Aging, but representing Self.
All right, thank you all. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. I would like Monica Attridge to come up, and then Randy Gray, you're on deck, and Stuart Goldman, you're after Randy. Monica, Go.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Monica Attridge. I am the CEO of the Hojoni Foundation in Flagstaff and Prescott. We've been in business 46 years. We serve about 150 clients with 250 employees. I am also the sister and guardian of a young man. Actually, I guess he's not young anymore. A middle-aged gentleman that lives in a group home and attends a day program here in Tempe. But I am here today as a member of the Arizona Association of Providers for People with Disabilities. And I'm here today to talk to you and ask you for your ask you to help provide adequate services to this very vulnerable population. We're happy to see that there is money for dental coverage in the governor's budget, but that's a pretty small piece of the network of services that we offer. Our services are struggling under a huge avalanche of challenges. Despite small gains in the last several years, many services are still funded before 2006 levels. To answer some of your questions, Senator Smith, Mr. Chairman, we were last funded at 100% in 2008. We had two cuts of 5% and 10%. We've gotten back little pieces, I think that a total of 8% over the years. There was no increase last year. Overall, we're funded, all of our services are funded at about 78%. 72% is what our room and board is funded at, which is our rent, utilities, food, that kind of thing. We have just this crush of federal and state regulations that's threatening to bury us even further. Rising utility costs and operating costs, food costs. We're running out of options to consolidate, reduce services, and maximize efficiencies. We're experiencing a severe direct provider shortage. I have 40 open positions, a turnover rate of 68%, and I can only afford to pay $8.55 an hour. Our direct care staff hasn't had an increase in 5 years. Our admin staff hasn't had an increase in 7 years. We've heard that state employees doing the exact same services are earning substantially more with substantially higher benefits. We can't compete with that or the retail industry or fast food. In addition to the direct care worker shortage we're facing, we also are seeing that, as we were talking, the food and shelter is out of control. Food prices are rising astronomically, especially in my area and some of the other rural areas. We are getting about somewhere between $4 and $5 a day per person to feed our individuals that we take care of. It's next to impossible. I know my organization has approached the food bank to help us. We get $1,000 a month for a 4-bedroom house in Flagstaff that goes for $1,800 to $1,900 a month. So we're losing money hand over fist. We lost $500,000 plus last year. We're going to lose $300,000 to $400,000 this year on the same trajectory. Then if you give us an increase, that won't even help that because that doesn't start till next fiscal year. At this rate, we would be in business for just another couple of years after 46 years. The 7% that we're asking for, if you were to give that to us, will only plug the hole. It won't allow us to increase wages. It won't allow us to have finer meals. It'll just make sure we don't go out of business while we're coming down and asking for more money next year. Providers are leaving the network at near record levels. We cannot hire or keep qualified direct care staff. The underfunding just has to stop. The problems are steep and only getting worse. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving us the opportunity to help educate your committee today on what's going on, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I want to thank you, everybody in this room who has something to do with this effort. I really respect what you do. I personally will try to do what I can do to help you. I really, you're doing God's work, as the saying goes, and I think it matters. With that, Senator Allen, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your presentation. You did very well, and I'm looking forward. I'm going to be touring her facility this Friday when I'm in Flagstaff. The in talking about this reduction that you've had since, was it 2009 when they cut the providers?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, so all these years we haven't been able to restore that cut, as we slowly had to restore a lot of cuts that we've made in government. So it is about time to be looking at your situation. But my question is, if you go out of business, what will happen to all of your clients? Who's going to take them?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Allen, chances are what would happen is that the clients would end up having to come to a metropolitan area where the larger providers are and they could be served. So they would lose their family supports, their community supports, and in a lot of cases, their cultural supports.
Well, and Mr. Chairman and ma'am, the point too, though, is somebody's still going to have to pick up that tab and still pay for that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And if there weren't any providers to do it, I'm sorry, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Senator Allen, if there weren't any providers to do it, the state would have to do it.
And Mr. Chairman, and I believe that the private providers do provide a savings to the state. I guess that's the question for the Director of DES, but that's why the state hires private providers, because it does save the state money.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Allen, yes, years ago when the system was privatized, that was the idea, that there would be a substantial cost savings.
Well, thank you very much, and hopefully we can see what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Allen. Thank you, Monica. Any other questions for Monica? Hearing none, who's up?
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward just here a little bit. We had one other person that we asked to testify, which was a parent, and want you all to hear a little bit of what he had to say as well.
Let's talk a little more.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and last we have Mr. Stuart Goldman.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, we are very appreciative of this opportunity to briefly share our story with you. For the record, I'm Stuart Goldman, and I will be speaking for my daughter, Miriam Goldman, because she is unable to speak for herself. Miriam is a recipient of services funded by DES, specifically DDD within DES. The extra hands that the service providers can give us because of this funding has allowed Miriam to have a full life. It has allowed my wife and I to be gainfully employed and of course to be taxpayers, which is I know important, okay? And it has also allowed us to maintain our sanity by being part of the fuller, wider community. I'm not sure what our condition would be if both of us were home 7/24, dealing with a very narrow focus of the immediate hour-by-hour care for our daughter. We love her, but it's great that we have other hands helping share the load. So why am I here talking to you? It's because Miriam becomes very attached to the individual caregivers that are provided for her. And every time we turn our head, there's a new caregiver. What happened to the old one? Well, the old one left, so here's a new one. Miriam goes through a grieving process every time she loses one of these caregivers, which is like family to her. She may stop eating for a few days. She may not sleep well. Her behaviors sometimes disintegrate and require additional medications to deal with the trauma because she doesn't understand why this person is gone. Okay, so then she gets a new person. The new person doesn't know Miriam and has a learning period to learn how to work with Miriam, her idiosyncrasies and so on. Miriam requires a period of time to accept and bond with the new person. Okay, and then we get that result, we turn our head, and guess what? We're there again. Okay, other people have spoken to you of why this is happening. This is the turnover rate being over 50%. And other people have spoken to you as why the turnover rate is over 50%. And others have spoken to you about what the Senate and the legislature can do to reduce the turnover rate, which is directly related to the pay and the budget. That's really what I have to tell you, sir. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Are there any questions?
Okay, so that was the Senate Committee Appropriations hearing for the DES budget. Again, really important for APAD to have our folks there and be present and talk to the committee, but clearly by the questions that were asked and the comments that were made, you can see that the work ahead of time was also very important. So we'll talk a lot about this when we talk about advocacy in our next webinar, but it's really important to provide that general information, that education throughout all of these budget hearings before and after, because the budget negotiations take place throughout the entire legislative session. So the leadership, those who are in charge of the initial negotiations for the budget, meet with each other and the executive on a regular basis throughout this entire time. So after the executive budget is released, that time while committee hearings are going on, there are regular meetings that are taking place. So again, it's important for APAD to be meeting with its legislators on a regular basis to make sure that they understand our concerns, that they understand the different issues. Monica and Stuart did a great job of really talking about the direct care provider shortage and issues that are concerning APAD members. And then those conversations that APAD is having with legislators then are part of the conversations that legislators are having during these big budget negotiations in what are called small groups. So during the negotiations, the leadership who are involved in the negotiations with the executive will come back to the House and the Senate members and meet with them in small groups, a couple of legislators at a time, and talk to them about the negotiations and how they're going and hear from their members about their concerns and what they want to see in the budget. And so us having conversations with legislators on an individual basis, whether that's through email or in-person meetings, having public testimony is all important throughout that entire process as these negotiations take place. Once an agreement is reached by the leadership, then the budget bills are drafted, and that comes out as the budget agreement. And from that point forward, the budget process can take a few days or it could take a few weeks to pass the actual budget bills. And this depends on whether or not that agreement that has been reached by the leadership with the executive, with the governor's office, becomes the agreement that the majority of the majority agree with. So you might remember from our first webinar, you need 16 and 31 votes. So 16 senators, 31 House of Representative members in order to pass a bill, and that goes for the budget as well. So when the leadership comes down with their agreement that they believe they've reached, they are then trying to get and make sure that they have 16 and 31 votes respectively out of each chamber in order to get the budget out. So at this point in time, when the bills are drafted, we are now basically back to that original process that we talked about in our first webinar, where bills are introduced and we go through the committee process. So there's a few bills that are part of a budget. It's not just one bill. There's somewhere between 10 and 15 bills that are introduced that make up the budget. The first bill, the primary budget bill, is the General Appropriations Act, or also known as the FEED bill. This bill includes the appropriations of the general fund monies or other dedicated funds to the state agencies for the upcoming fiscal year, as well as any supplementals that they might need for the current fiscal year. Then there's a bill known as the Capital Outlay Bill, which is a separate bill which appropriates money for capital projects in state agencies. There's also a budget reconciliation bill, and there will be numerous budget reconciliation bills because each bill deals with a subject area and the statutory changes that are necessary in order to enact the budget. So you'll have a health burb, you'll hear us call them burbs, criminal justice, human services, environment. And so depending on what's in the budget and depending on what statutory changes need to be made, there will be various burbs that are related to those subject areas to make those changes. So from a DDD perspective for APAD, we take a look at the FEED bill and then the burb that entails any changes to DES, which is usually known as the Human Services burb. So this first bill that we're going to take a look at is the feed bill, or the General Appropriations Act. So this is House Bill 2695, which was the bill that was passed out in this last budget cycle. This first page that you're taking a look at is just a random one that I chose for us to look at so that you can see that there are all the different line items. So up there at the top, you see section 14 is circled Office of Administrative Hearings. So this is the Office of Administrative Hearings budget. You'll see underneath that they have 12 FTEs that have been appropriated to them, so 15 or 12 positions. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of them are filled, but that's what they've been appropriated. And then you'll see here that they have a lump sum appropriation, and the fund source here is the state general fund. So they received $161,700 of state general fund monies for fiscal year 17. Going down, you have the Arizona Commission of African American Affairs. You have the Arizona Department of Agriculture. These are all separate budget line items. Again, this is the feed bill. Literally everything's in here. And then you have the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System. As you can imagine, there's multiple line items to access. And so this is just the very short beginning of it and would go on to another page. But you can see here, Access has 2,326 FTE positions. And they have several different line items of money, not just general fund. Here at the beginning of this, you can see they have Proposition 204 monies, which was a voter initiative passed a few years ago. So they'll have different line items as well. So this is what the budget looks like in general, and there is a line for every state agency and the amount of money that they get. So in that same budget bill, this is the Department of Economic Security's budget. So you see here, this was the beginning. DES was given 4,218 FTE positions or people. And what we take a look at when we take a look at their budget is the section for developmental disabilities. You'll see over here on the right-hand side. So they had an operating lump sum of $49 million. They receive case management monies, and then home and community-based services, $994 million. And so that's what we look at. What's interesting and hard for us to see in the feed bill, however, is what does that really mean? Is $994 million an increase? Is it a decrease? What happened? And so until we take a look at what was in the executive budget and looking at JLBC and some of the summary documents that they provide, or if we happen to know what they had in the budget the year before, it's hard for us to see this. So we take this information along with what's given by the executive, what's given by JLBC, for us to determine what that number really means. The other piece that's really important to the budget in the feed bill that helps us understand what's happening here is what are called footnotes. So this is the same bill. This is the end of the line items for the Department of Economic Security. So over here, this is the end of DES's budget, the rest of it. And underneath this green line, you see all this writing. These are known as footnotes. And these are directions to the agency on how they should spend the money. So if there are certain requirements that the legislature and the governor in this case would have agreed to, that they want the agency to do with that money, this is where they would put that. So beyond the line items that we just saw, the footnotes become very important for how DDD is required to spend its money. So if you look over here at the right-hand side under developmental disabilities in this paragraph that's circled in green, this is the language that was adopted in this year's budget about the 1% increase. So this is the direction to the Division of Developmental Disabilities on how they should spend the additional monies. And it talks about that the monies are for an across-the-board 1% full-year rate adjustment for home and community-based service providers, and that whose current rates are less than 100% of the benchmark rates that were published in 2014. So this language is what ensures that the additional money that the Division of Developmental Disabilities is getting in the budget goes to what, in this case, APAD had requested, which was an increase for reimbursement rates. Over the last couple of years, APAD has worked with the legislature to have that footnote language in the budget to make sure that that money went where we were hoping that it would go. If this language wasn't in there, then the division would have the ability and the department would have the ability to spend that money where they see fit. Could still be a 1% increase, for example, for reimbursement rates, but it would not have to be. It would be up to their discretion. So again, this was the feed bill or the general appropriations bill. One of the places that we look at in the budget to see and understand what's going on. The other thing that we want to look at is the BURB. In this case, it was House Bill 2705, the Human Services Budget Reconciliation Budget. In this year's budget, there were not a whole lot of changes for DDD that were concerning or of interest to APAD. In this case, there was some changes on the Arizona training program. And so if you look on the right-hand side, this language over here in blue talks about the department's requirements for how they're going to transition the Arizona training program, Coolidge. And so this was directing the department to provide updates to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee on their timelines, the new residential settings, and so forth. So this was part of the budget in that there are changes back in the feed bill that deal with the changes that they're making at Coolidge. And so these are the directions in statute that now talk about how DDD needs to implement that and the information that they need to provide. So the combination of both bills is what gives us the entire budget from a DDD perspective and what APAD would be taking a look at and what we might have concerns with or might be very much supportive of if we've gotten what we wanted into it. So as I talked about before, the budget, so now that it's drafted, basically goes through the process that we talked about before in the last webinars. So it's going to go through committee, it's going to go through caucus, and it's going to go through the committee of the whole. We're going to watch today is committee of whole for the feed bill. And you are going to see the start of the committee of the whole, which we didn't see in the last webinar. So if you caught this one, the last webinar, this will be good to watch because you'll get to see how the committee of the whole starts. You're also going to hear the President of the Senate get up and talk quite a bit about a huge amendment that is being adopted. That amendment represents changes to the agreement on the budget. So the budget was put out in budget bill form, in regular bill form, as an agreement, and they had to make more changes, again, to get that 16 and 31, to get those votes they need. So this amendment you're going to hear the President describes are all the different changes that are happening in the budget in order to get the budget passed.
Committee of the whole is called to order, or excuse me, the Senate is called to order. Committee of the whole number 2, Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate resolve itself into a committee of the whole for the consideration of the bills on the calendar.
You've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye. Opposed, no. I spirit have it, do have it so ordered. I'll ask Senator Smith to chair this count.
So each committee of the whole has a different chairman, and the President chooses that chairman for the committee of the whole. So he's chosen Senator Smith to chair this committee of the whole. And you're going to see here, he's working with Susan Estevez, who's the Secretary of the Senate, to go through how the committee of the whole needs to work. There's several amendments that are being proposed, including the one I mentioned that President Biggs is going to talk about. And so he has to work through those amendments in a procedural format in order to make sure that they vote on them properly. So he's working with the secretary to make sure that they do that and in which order that they do those amendments in, so that every amendment gets voted on in the correct order that it should be in order to not cause conflicts in the bill. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here.
Thank you very much. Without objection, so ordered. Let's read the first bill on the calendar with recommendations, please.
Senate Bill 1526, enact amending laws 2014, Chapter 14, Section 9, as amended by laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 3, amending laws 2014, Chapter 18, Section 118, as amended by laws 2014, Second Special Session, Chapter 2, Section 3, and laws 2015, and Chapter 8, Section 4, amending laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 103, amending laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 104, amending laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 105, amending laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 106, amending laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 107, amending laws 2015, Chapter 8, Section 136, repealing law 2015, Chapter 8, Section 140, 141, and 143, appropriating monies. The committee will recommend following bills are proper for consideration. Senate Bill 1526, and the Chairman, Mr. President, Committee on Appropriations, I've had considerations. Senate Bill 1526 relates to general appropriations 2016, 2017. So what's following part, the committee recommended the bill to pass on Dutch Chair.
Thank you. Before we call on the president, we're going to say hi and bye to what appears to be a whole group full of potential students that are walking in on one side and leaving on the other side. Welcome. Mr. President, would you please move Senate Bill 1526?
Mr. Chairman, I move that when the committee of the whole rise and report to give SB 1526 a due pass recommendation.
Thank you very much. Members, we have 3 of these amendments are conflicting amendments. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take them, we're going to do the Biggs floor amendment, the Pancrazi, then the Quesada. We're going to move those 3, then go back in order and vote on those 3. Then we'll take the other amendments. So let's start with the Biggs floor amendment. Let's read that.
Biggs floor amendment, 1526, and Biggs.
Mr. President, would you move your floor amendment, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that the Biggs floor amendment to SB 1526 be adopted.
And now there is also a reference to the Biggs floor amendment that we want to read, and we're going to vote on that one now. And if that passes, we will then come back and re-vote in the same order that I just mentioned. So let's, yes, and Mr. President, before we do your second floor amendment, your reference to, would you explain, please, briefly, your first floor amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I will. It makes a lot of different changes to what you might have heard out there. So let me go through these. It increases the hit of sweep from 50 million to 78.9 million. The original was $100 million as enacted last year. So it's a net reduction of $21.1 million. Reallocates funding between DCS operating and DCS caseworkers line items to reflect more accurate numbers. It modifies the DCS out-of-home benchmark footnote. It removes $1.6 million for the Northern Region Community Correction Center. That will be funded from non-general fund services revenues. It increases DES domestic violence shelter funding by $1.5 million. ADE increases admin by $400,000, other funds for ESA administration. It removes references to teacher certification fund subaccounts. It increases $5.3 million general fund for multi-site charters. There was originally $1.2 million in the original bill. So this takes that total to $6.5 million. It is sometimes referred to as the small school wave. Increases one-time district-sponsored charter funding, $574,000 to a total of $1.1 thousand for probation officer salaries.
So I'm just going through here. You can hear there were a lot of
It has
changes.
a fund swapping, fund source fund, school facilities and FPRS contribution in FY16, $5 million other funds to state parks in FY17 for operating costs, contingent upon demonstration of a loss of federal funds. It exempts from procurement the small water systems appropriation. It appropriates $23.1 million general fund for in 18.
Thank you, Mr. President. And why don't we go ahead now and move and read the Biggs floor amendment in reference to the Biggs floor amendment.
Biggs floor amendment, Senate Bill 1526, and Biggs.
Mr. President, would you kindly move your floor amendment referencing your first floor amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that the Biggs floor amendment dated 5/3/2016 at 12:36 a.m. reference to the Biggs floor amendment to SB 1526 be adopted.
Thank you, sir. And a brief description on that one as well.
Yes, this appropriates an additional $947,700 from state general fund in FY 2017 to Superior Courts for probation and treatment services.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the Biggs floor amendment dated 5/3/16 at 12:36 a.m. as a reference to the Biggs floor amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Ayes have it, do have it, so ordered. We will come back now and vote in a minute on the Biggs floor amendment as amended. But first, we're going to go ahead and move the Pancrazi floor amendment, since again, these are conflicting amendments. So Can we read the Pancrazi floor amendment?
Pancrazi floor amendment, Senate Bill 1526, stand Pancrazi.
Thank you. Senator Pancrazi.
Mr. Chair, I move that the Pancrazi floor amendment to Senate Bill 1526 be adopted.
Thank you very much. Brief description.
Senate Bill 1526 gives $1 million to, or a 1% increase to the DDD providers rate, but the 1%, although I support it, it just doesn't do enough to even meet their, to cover inflation. They need a 2%. And so all this does is add one more percent, which is 2.9 million, to the DDD providers so that they can provide for our most vulnerable folks in the state of Arizona. It is a small amount to be considered for those who are the most vulnerable in this state. So with that, I hope that you will support the Pancrazi amendment.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Senator Hobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of the Pancrazi floor amendment. And the DD providers have been coming to the legislature repeatedly over the last several years related to this budget item. And they haven't gotten a raise, and they desperately need it. They've been cut along with a lot of other social services. And as Senator Pancrazi said, these are folks that are caring for our most vulnerable citizens. The job they do is really hard. They're doing basic needs care for these people. Sometimes they are changing diapers of adults, and they're in a position where there's the potential for abuse and neglect of this population. And if we can't pay these folks an adequate wage, then we're not going to get qualified people doing this work, and we're putting our vulnerable citizens at risk. So I support the Pancrazi floor amendment to give these providers a raise, and I would urge other members to support it.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Majority Leader, Senator Yarborough.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in respectful opposition to the Pancrazi floor amendment.
Thank you, sir. Chair recognizes Senator Lesko.
Okay, so that was the beginning of the committee of whole process for 1526, which again was the General Appropriations Act, or the feed bill. So you heard President Biggs describe a very long amendment, and I skipped through a lot of it. Again, that reflected the deal or the agreement that had been reached at the time for the rest of the budget to get the votes that they needed to pass that budget out. You heard Senator Pancrazi offer an amendment. You heard Ms. Katie Hobbs get up and support that amendment, which we greatly appreciated from an APAD perspective. Unfortunately, that was not part of the budget agreement. So then who you saw as the Majority Leader, Mr. Yarborough, stand up and respectfully oppose that amendment. That is an indication to his caucus that that amendment is not a part of the agreement for the budget. And so he respectfully is saying, please don't vote for that. And so what we're not going to see today, just because of time, is then the process, because there's about another hour and a half of debate that goes through here. But eventually there is a voice vote on Ms. Pancrazi's amendment, and that amendment does fail again because it wasn't part of the budget discussion or the budget agreement, but we did very much appreciate her bringing that up. So after the committee of the whole, just like we talked about before, then there is a third read vote that needs to take place. Once those votes happen, the bill then is set up to the governor for action, just like regular bills are. So the governor can sign the budget bills. He can let them go into effect without his signature. He can veto the bills, he or she. They can also line item veto appropriations. So the governor can take through the feed bill, can literally line out certain line item appropriations that they would like. So for example, let's say that they disagreed with an increase. They could line out increase in the feed bill that you saw. If the governor chooses to veto or to line item veto a bill, if the legislature is in session, they can go back and try and override those changes with a 2/3 vote of each chamber. And again, those are the same requirements that were the case for regular bills as well, that we talked about in the last webinar. The General Appropriations Act, so that fee bill takes effect immediately. However, the majority of what's happening in that Appropriation Act does become really effective on July 1st because it's for the next fiscal year. But if there were any changes for the current fiscal year, those would take effect immediately. And then the budget reconciliation bills, those BURBs, those subject area changes generally take effect 90 days after the session ends. So that's the budget process. Again, very similar to what happens with regular bills, but there is a lot of hearings that take place on the budget in general before the budget hearing takes place on the actual budget bill, and then there's a lot of negotiations that take place with the leadership and with their members before those bills ever come to fruition. So real quickly, just wanted to give you all some general information about the current budget. This is where our current fiscal year general fund appropriations went. So you'll see that 42% was K-12 education, 19% went to Access and DHS. You might know that mental health went over to Access. It was in DHS, and so they're now combining those two as sort of a healthcare agency when they take a look at healthcare. DES receives 5% of the general fund budget. And then this is where the general fund revenues come from. So we get about 45% of the state revenue from sales tax, and we get 40% of it from individual income tax. So I just think always interesting to take a look at. And then corporate income tax, we get about 5% of our revenue from that. This is to give you a sense, the comparison of the 10 largest general fund budgets and what they looked like in fiscal year 2007 compared to 2017. So if you take a look on the right-hand side, for me, the bar graphs are easier. You can see that, for example, DES had about a $7 billion budget. Now we're at 9 total funds. And then let's take a look at our tax sources. Again, we took a look at where they were in that pie chart. This is where they've come through compared from fiscal year 2007 to 2017. If you take a look on the right-hand side, you can see that sales tax is about the same from 10 years ago. We get a little bit more in individual income, and the corporate taxes have definitely decreased since state fiscal year 2007. We do get a lot of questions about those tax cuts, and so this is some information about where the next phase-in of about $228 million of tax reductions will take place. So those are your fiscal years, fiscal year 18, 19, and 20 here in the middle. And then these are the tax cuts that are coming on board. You have a corporate rate reduction, sales factor change that's happening. It will be a $74 million decrease to the state budget in 18, and then $52 million in 19, and so forth. So these are your totals here for the budget of where those tax reductions will take place over the next 3 fiscal years. Then you hear a lot of talk at the legislature and what Goodman Schwartz will talk to APAD about the structural general fund balance. This is the difference between ongoing revenues and ongoing expenditures. The state legislature has taken a look at this quite a bit in trying to balance the budget, and the executive as well in trying to balance the budget. So this is where our ongoing revenues and ongoing expenditures, that difference between the two has resulted over the last few years. And what that then means for fiscal year 18 is that the Joint Legislative Budget Committee is estimating that we will have a $24 million structural balance for fiscal year 18 at the moment. So again, what that means is that there will be slightly more ongoing revenues for the state versus ongoing spending. So we'll have about $24 million left between revenues and spending. That gives us a cash balance of about $101 million. And what that means is that there's some money left over, but that money may not be ongoing revenue. And so they're going to consider that one-time revenue. So this is the current estimates that JLBC is putting out. It gives us a good sense of what the legislature is taking a look at. I would say that that $24 million is probably the most important number from an APAD perspective, in that what Republican, especially legislators, are looking at and the executive is looking at is that that $24 million is sort of what's available for ongoing spending should they decide to spend more money on any type of new program or, in our case, to backfill some cuts that were made. So with that, wanted to provide you the revenue and expenditure outlook for the next few fiscal years. As we talked about at the beginning, we have to look at 3 fiscal years legislatively speaking, and so you'll see that structural balance here for fiscal year 18 of 24 million. Then they are projecting here 146 million, and then 264 million in fiscal year 20. So as you can see, the outlook looks good, but as we talked about, a 1% difference in revenues can change the outlook of these numbers quite a bit. But this is the current picture that the legislature has for the next 3 fiscal years. So I want to thank you all very much today for your time. Appreciate you listening to this webinar about the budget. Hope it's been helpful, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. I think we've got a few minutes if anybody does have any questions.
Okay, if you do have any questions, be sure to use that chat feature on the right-hand side to ask them. If you think of something after we close the webinar out, please feel free to email either Brandy or myself. You can find contact information for us on the APAD website, or just email info@aappd.org. And Brandy, it does look like we have a question there.
Yeah, so the question is, going back to Committee of the Whole, or CAL, at what point did the 1% pass? So that 1% was actually in the introduced budget bill that we saw, so 2695, the feed bill that we took a look at. So that is how the bill went to Committee of the Whole, is the 1% was actually in the bill when Committee of the Whole took a look at it. So what we were watching for from an APAD perspective was, one, making sure, and we were pretty sure already, but we always want to be 100% sure that there were no changes in that amendment that Mr. Biggs was reading, because that amendment would have been the agreed upon amendment again. And so if there were any changes in there, that's what we would have looked for. And then obviously we would have loved to have seen Ms. Pancrazi's amendment pass, which would have done an additional 1%. But in this case, there were no changes in the Biggs amendment, which we were 99.9% sure was going to be the case, unfortunately, at that time. And so it was basically already in the bill. And so when they voted in third read, it was in the bill as amended and already there. So it basically went through committee with the 1% in it. Thank you for that question. Good question.
All right. Does anybody else have other questions? While we're waiting here, I just want to throw out, like I did last webinar, that we do teach our legislative processes in a vacuum, and in reality it looks and feels different, mainly because you throw a lot of different personalities into the mix with our legislators. And so this next session will have all new personalities and dynamics to navigate. And so I'll put in a plug here. You choose these personalities and the legislative leadership by voting. If you're registered, please do vote early if you can, or on election day in 20-ish days. Countdown is on. And then the process does take an entire year to come to fruition for the budget. And during session, depending on how negotiations go, it might feel like we're jamming things down your throat with emails, or it may feel like you haven't heard anything in a while. And it may be a combination of both of those things. And that's because we have to operate at the speed of the legislature. So at times, especially when the budget is moving toward passage, budget hearings are scheduled with relatively short notice. And for advocacy purposes, we have to put together the information we need you to pass on to your legislators and send it out as soon as we learn of those hearings or other opportunities. And at times we only have a couple of hours to act. So that's why paying a close attention to calls to action during this time frame is so important. Something that we may put out at 9 p.m. at night is breaking news at that time, but could be old news by the next morning. So long story short, we try to give you those updates in as real time as possible and with as much information as possible. But if you don't see it until sometime later, it's already likely going to be old news. And we will talk about advocacy and politics and how to talk to legislators at future trainings. Our next webinar is going to be on advocacy specifically on November 9th. We'll send an email out on that after this. And don't forget that our webinars and resources are all located online. We're also happy to help you understand a concept or get started with your own advocacy efforts at any time. So please feel free to reach out. All right, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. If you do have questions, be sure to email us. Thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn more about the state budget. Brandy, do you have anything to say before we sign off here?
No, thank you. Just want to say thank you to everybody again. And as Rochelle said, just email us if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Email us if you have questions, and we'll see you during the next webinar.